Okay, everybody, my name is Wayne Ranney, and I am unable to advance my screen. There we go. I am the vice president this year of the Grand Canyon Historical Society, and I welcome all of you to our virtual outing tonight. We're going to take a trip up north from Grand Canyon to Capitol Reef National Park, one of my favorite, probably my favorite national park in all the state of Utah. And we'll be listening to Stephen Trimble and his vast experience there in Capitol Reef National Park. Um, Trying to advance here, but I can't advance. There we go. There's a couple of photographs of Capitol Reef. Maybe some of you in the listening audience have had the pleasure of visiting Capitol Reef. And if you haven't, I'm sure you will by next summer after you see the program tonight. So if any of you are joining us tonight who are not members of the Grand Canyon Historical Society, we invite you to become a member. The dues are only $35 per year. We are an all-volunteer organization. And if you enjoy what you see tonight, we'd be happy to have you as a member. Your membership includes 4 times a year getting the quarterly magazine, The Old Pioneer, which always has great articles about the history of the Grand Canyon region. Grand Canyon is the focus, but the region is also something that we cover. And we do these virtual outings once a month. We occasionally have in-person tours on the south or north rim of the Grand Canyon, and all things Grand Canyon history can be found on our website, which is very easy to recognize. It's grandcanyonhistory.org, and you can find out all the information about our programs there. We also facilitate an oral history program for those who have a story to tell. And if you know someone who would like to participate in an oral history and just talk about their experiences at Grand Canyon, we've interviewed people who have just been visitors and were touched by it. So we'd be happy to do an oral history with anybody there. And if you have an idea for a presentation, please contact us at outings@grandcanyonhistory.org. That's outings@grandcanyonhistory.org. And we invite you to join us next month for our next virtual outing, which will be a Tuesday again, January 9th, where Alan Peterson, the curator of art at the Museum of Northern Arizona, will present some of his research on Gunnar Wigforss, the painter of the national parks. Alan Peterson has been studying the life and career of Gunnar Wigforss, who is probably one of the most prolific Grand Canyon artists to ever visit that. And he also painted many other national parks, as well as some areas, believe it or not, down near Scottsdale, Arizona. So I am going to exit my screen here, and I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker is Stephen Trimble. Steve was born in Denver, Colorado, which served as his family's base for roaming the West. And he had a great mentor with his father, who was a geologist. Trimble read passionately as a young boy and started writing as a teenager, and he just kept writing. A liberal arts education led to work as a park ranger, where he worked in Arches, Great Sand Dunes, and of course, Capitol Reef. And for a while, he was the museum press director at the Museum in Northern Arizona, where I first met him in 1978. We both started at the museum in 1978. As writer, editor, and photographer, Trimble has published 25 award-winning books during 45 years of paying attention to the landscapes and peoples of the Desert West. In 2019, Trimble was honored as one of Utah's 15 most influential artists. Trimble speaks and writes frequently as a conservation advocate and has taught writing at the University of Arizona, where he received a prestigious Wallace Stegner Fellowship at the Tanner Humanities Center during the centennial of Stegner's birth. The breadth of his awards mirrors the wide embrace of his work. The Sierra Club's Ansel Adams Award for Photography and Conservation, the National Cowboys Museum Western Heritage Wrangler Award, and a Doctor of Humane Letters from his alma mater, Colorado College. Trimble makes his home in Salt Lake City and has a second home in the Red Rock country of Torrey, Utah, located right on the western boundary of Capitol Reef National Park. For more about his work, you can visit stephentrimble.net. And it is my extreme pleasure tonight to introduce you to Stephen Trimble.
Thank you so much, Wayne. I am delighted to be here. Thanks to you and to Susan Collins, the other co-host tonight. And thanks to Tom Martin, who signed me up to do this. I actually think Tom wants me to talk about my Grand Canyon photography book in a few months for y'all, Lasting Light. So I'll have a chance to come back then. I did teach at the University of Utah, not the University of Arizona. So just to keep the geography straight, I'll offer that minor correction to Wayne's generous introduction. I met Wayne when we worked at the museum in Flagstaff all those years ago. We shared a great river trip, and it's really a delight to come back and share the evening with Wayne and all of you. I still love the Grand Canyon, even though I haven't lived right next to it for a very long time. It's part of my home territory, the Colorado Plateau, which is going to lead to what we're going to talk about tonight. So what I'm going to do is go directly to slides. I still call them slides, although they're digital images on our screens these days. And I'll let the pictures carry us through my talk tonight. And then I'll come back at the end face-to-face and answer your questions. So let me see if I can get my screen share going here. And I'm going to do a couple little adjustments to make sure that you're not seeing anything extra. I think that's it. So this talk is really based on a book that I published in 2019, the Capitol Reef Reader. The University of Utah Press had started a series that they're continuing now of national park readers that collect the very best writing about regional national parks. They started with Glacier and a Colorado River reader that is kind of like a Grand Canyon reader. And they since have published the Zion National Park reader and the Grand Tetons reader and my book and Rocky Mountain National Park. And I think the next one up will be Arches. And so eventually, I think they hope to get to all of the regional national parks. It's a wonderful idea. So I want to thank the University of Utah Press for publishing this series. It's a great resource for all of us who care about regional literature and care about these incredible landscapes. When the general editors of this series, Dave Stanley and Lance Newman, asked me if I would edit the Capitol Reef volume, of course I said yes. I wasn't going to let anybody else snag this book. And thanks to Dave Livermore and the Nature Conservancy of Utah, who provided us with a grant to run color photographs throughout the book. The Capitol Reef Reader gathers 160 years worth of words that capture the spirit of the park and its surrounding landscape in personal narratives, philosophical riffs, and historic and scientific records. I've chosen these pieces for the character of their storytelling and language, while I've looked for an array of writing that reveals Capitol Reef in all its layers, from geology to history, from native peoples to 21st century canyoneers. I found pieces that are a pleasure to read and authors who tell us better than anyone else about some aspect of Capitol Reef. The reader also includes 100 photos, and you'll see most of them tonight. Nearly all of these are my pictures from decades of hiking and photographing here, plus a selection of historic black and whites and a handful from other photographers. So why was I so intent on editing this book? Remember that ad campaign during the centennial of the National Park Service in 2016? Find your park? This is my park. And when I lived in Flagstaff, I was a little sheepish because I didn't transfer my allegiance to the Grand Canyon. I was still a Southern Utah guy even then, and I still am. This is my spiritual home. And so this was a labor of love. I arrived in Capitol Reef in 1975 to work a season for the National Park Service as a seasonal ranger, knowing only a little. I was 24. I'd worked as a park ranger briefly at Arches and for a season in Colorado at Great Sand Dunes. I'd published my first little book for Park Natural History Associations, but I was a newcomer to all things Capitol Reef. This was a long time ago. When I first went out camping that summer, I was sleeping on top of picnic tables because I was afraid of scorpions. Living in Fruta in the settlers' orchards. Whoops, I'm having trouble with my advance too, just like Wayne was. So I'll go, whoa, what's going on? My slides are not advancing. Huh. Okay, I'll do it that way. Good thing there are different ways you can do that. Where was I? So I was living in Fruta in the little park headquarters there surrounding the visitor center in the old village of Fruta in the settlers' orchards under the big red cliff. That's what we called that huge expanse of Wingate sandstone that rose above us, watching the light change hour to hour, day to day, season to season. And every night, mule deer would come down from the mesa. And I see I've also got my my controls back. Let me get rid of those. Technical glitches, right? So every night the mule deer would come down from the mesa to spend the night in the orchards. And I was determined to get a good picture of them. And most nights they came down after dark, or they'd come down when I didn't have my camera. And finally one night I was playing volleyball with my buddies on the park staff down the road, and I saw these 3 bucks gradually working their way down the cliffs. And I ran home and got my camera and took this photograph that I've been publishing ever since. I captured that moment, and it made me very happy. I was hired as a seasonal in part to write and photograph in the park. And I wrote and photographed a general interpretive book for the Natural History Association that summer, emphasizing the backcountry. And I wrote and took pictures for Hickman Bridge Trail Guide, both publications long out of print. And when I do a reading like this in a bookstore, I can pass these around for everyone's amusement. And tonight I can only show you the covers. Notice the price on that little trail guide, 25 cents. This is a long time ago. But that's really how I served my apprenticeship as a writer and photographer, doing small books like that for Park Natural History Associations. But when I write, I research too. So 45 years ago, I began reading everything I could find about the park, and I've never stopped. I'm endlessly intrigued with the unending challenge of responding to this place in language, in capturing Capitol Reef in words. There are more than 50 excerpts in the reader. I don't expect you to start at page 1 and read on right through to the end. You'll flip through and read what catches your eye, what interests you. And so I'm going to structure tonight's talk kind of like that. I'm going to jump around and not try to go through the book page by page. Couldn't do that in an hour, certainly. So let's say you're flipping through the book and this picture brings you to a halt, as it might, especially if you're as old as I am and you remember that 1969 movie, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and maybe had a crush on either Robert Redford or Catherine Ross in those days. Butch, of course, was hiding out at Robber's Roost over by Canyonlands and had grown up in Circleville, Utah. And so the easiest path back and forth took him right through Capitol Reef and through the little villages, the little Mormon villages of Wayne County. And as it happened, one of those times that he came through the park to be, brought him to visit the Behunin family in this little cabin that they had built in 1883 along the Fremont River. Elijah Cutler Behunin and his wife Tabitha Jane had 13 children, and they discovered that that cabin and the dugouts they built around it were really a pretty remote and difficult place to live. So they lived full time there only for a year, but kept coming back in seasons to run their livestock and try to grow a little bit along the river. And on one of those times, Butch came through, and I have an excerpt in the book written by one of the granddaughters of the family who brings to life that moment when Butch stopped for lunch and wrote his name on the back of the cabin. And, we don't know for sure if it's real. The Park Service actually plastered over it in the 1990s. And I really don't know whether that's because they didn't think it was authentic or whether they were trying to protect it because it was authentic. But when I worked as a ranger at the park, one day we had an old timer come into the visitor center who told us that he was with Butch when he carved that name in the bricks, in the pieces of sandstone. And so who knows if it's real, but I believe that it's real. As I read about the park, I learned this was an important place for Native people. Archaeologists came in the 1920s and named the prehistoric Fremont culture for our local river, the Fremont. Paiute and Navajo people had lived here, and ancestral Pueblo people, the ancestors of today's Hopi and Zuni people. They all had come through and left rock art testimony to their passage. I looked far and wide for some first-person pieces by Native writers to include in the anthology, and I couldn't find anything that really fit. So I had to rely on a wonderful compendium from the Park Service cultural anthropologist Rosemary Susak, who interviewed a lot of the tribal folks about the relationship with Capitol Reef in the 1980s and put together those stories in a book that I could excerpt. I had to rely on archaeologists and writers as well to bring to life the prehistoric times. And one of those writers was Rose Hauk, who lives there in Flagstaff, writing about her hikes in the park and encountering rock art, as she described, in one of the finest outdoor galleries in the world, in a canyon of imagining. The spectacular, anomalous, rawhide pectoral shields were still on display in the Park Visitor Center when I worked here. And even then, I knew they had a fascinating story. Their journey since is even more astonishing. And I include an excerpt telling that story by historian Bob McPherson, who takes us through the twists and turns of the story of the shields. And I want to tell you that story in a little bit more detail. I think it's one of the most amazing stories in the book. That's Bishop Ephraim Porter Pectol in the middle, and his two lovely daughters, Glenda and Devona. And they're holding these big rawhide shields that the bishop dug up in a cave at the foot of the Red Cliffs in Capitol Reef. The bishop had a little store in Torrey in those days, and back in the 1920s, it was much more accepted to go digging in ruins and cultural sites for artifacts. And Bishop Pectol would bring back his treasures and display them in a little museum upstairs in his general store. And one day in 1926, he found these amazing shields that were unlike anything anyone had seen. Locals didn't know what they were. Archaeologists didn't know what they were. The bishop thought they actually explained some of the stories in the Book of Mormon. And for a while, they were exhibited at the museum on Temple Square back in Salt Lake City. And at the time that I was a ranger, they had migrated back to the park. That was the story of the shields for a long time. But in 1990, we passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And Native people began to pay some attention to all of these artifacts that were on display or squirreled away in museum collections, and were really rather upset and really wished that they would come home to where they were made. And in the late 1990s, some Native folks came through Capitol Reef and told the Park Service that there were some things there that really should go home. And so there were claims made, and many of the tribes that asked for the shields to be returned, really the only claim they had was, we used to live here, we surely made them, please send them back to us. But the Navajo had a different story. I want to read you a couple of paragraphs from the book, from Bob McPherson's piece about these shields. So the park asked the tribes to say, are these yours? Would you like them back? And the Navajo Nation deferred that question to John Holliday, who was a Navajo medicine man who was almost 100 years old, who had grown up in Monument Valley. His grandmother had actually herded sheep in the Capitol Reef area. And John Holliday knew exactly what those shields were. And here's what Bob McPherson wrote about that. John Holliday said, many goats with white hair created the shields, making them in the Kaibab Mountains in a thick pine forest with a circular clearing. And over the years, custody of those shields went from many goats with white hair to man who keeps his mouth open, and then yellow forehead, tall skinny man, man who wants to sit down, side person, man who plays with the wooden cards, man with metal teeth, ropey, and finally to little bitter waterman. John Holliday knew the names of the shields: Earth Protective Shield, Heaven's Protective Shield, Mountain Protective Shield. And he pointed out that little bitter waterman had control of the shields at the time that Kit Carson was ready to round up Navajo people and force them to march to eastern New Mexico in the Long Walk. And little bitter waterman was concerned that the shields would be captured, so he hid them. He buried them, then left the area, but he became sick and died without telling anyone where they were. And so the shields remained misplaced for all those years until the bishop dug them up. Well, of course, the Park Service believed that story. And when it came time to repatriate the shields, they went to the Navajo Tribal Museum where they reside today. And Navajo people, Navajo medicine men, are able to use them in the way that they should be used. I just think that's the most amazing story. And I feel very privileged to even have seen the shields in those earlier days. So when I say Capitol Reef, what do I mean? It's not just the national park. It's not just the zigzag straight lines of the park boundary. I define Capitol Reef more broadly. Here's the regional map that reminds you where we are, going all the way from Denver over to Salt Lake and down to Wupatki, so Flagstaff just off the map. And the remarkable thing about the Colorado Plateau is this just complex of preserved areas, from Grand Staircase over to Bears Ears in southern Utah, up to Arches and Canyonlands National Parks, over to Bryce and Zion National Parks. Capitol Reef lies within that red rectangle. And I still like this map that we made for my little book back in the 1970s, because I think it really brings to life the topography of the area. That white zigzag line is the park boundary. The yellow line is the water pocket fold, that wrinkle in the Earth's crust that's really the very reason for Capitol Reef National Park. And the green areas are highlands. And so I think of Capitol Reef country as starting at this eastern rim of Boulder Mountain, where you look out across Capitol Reef to the Henry Mountains. The water pocket fold runs all the way from Thousand Lake Mountain up here at the north, clear down to the Colorado River. And then as you go west, you reach the Escalante River, all the canyons and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. So it's a big piece of country, but it does have a lot of coherence. And the view from Boulder Mountain toward the Henrys is really where I think Capitol Reef literature begins. It begins with Clarence Dutton, waxing eloquent in 1880 as he gazed over the water pocket fold from the rim of Boulder Mountain, sent here to do geology by John Wesley Powell, but bowled over by what he called the sublime panorama, the superlative desert. The same view that Wallace Stegner was thinking of when he wrote the Wilderness Letter and called this the geography of hope. I wanted to find my way to less known writers as well, and I found Michigan writer Linda Elizabeth Peterson's essay, where she writes movingly of being undone by that view from Boulder Mountain. Way up north, beyond the water pocket fold, there are two dry valleys that are included in Capitol Reef National Park, South Desert and Cathedral Valley. And these places have their own literature that begins really early. It begins with Solomon Carvalho, who took the very first photograph of Capitol Reef when he came through with the John Charles Fremont expedition, and took a photograph that was later reproduced in his book as an etching after the original photographs were lost in a snowstorm. Well, 150 years later, Bob Schler taught himself how to make daguerreotypes and came back to reproduce Carvalho's image in this modern daguerreotype of those three monoliths that together we now call Mom, Pop, and Henry. And I also include Carvalho's own harrowing account of nearly freezing to death on that expedition through the Park to Be, trying to get up and over Thousand Lake Mountain midwinter, an excerpt from his 1860 bestseller. Even though this is surely the least visited section of the park, the temples of the sun and moon have become the iconic images of Capitol Reef because of their easily grasped monumentality, because of their graphic boldness. We don't have delicate arch, but we do have the temples. And when you see one of those rental RVs with a national park painted on the side and with New York plates, for Capitol Reef, they used the Temple of the Moon and the Temple of the Sun. I reached out to other writers, especially to younger writers, and especially to women. And my inquiry to Anne Marie Vivian turned loose her letter to her grandfather, acknowledging the power and balm of Cathedral Valley, the place her grandfather went to try to heal himself from his PTSD after World War II. So Capitol Reef turns out to have a surprisingly rich literature, and it just keeps going. It's alive, with a lot of emotion, even love, in these words. The editors of the Arches and Bryce Canyon volumes in this National Park Reader series are having a hard time finding the same wealth of writing. And I think I've figured out the reason. Capitol Reef turns out to be more passageway than barrier. We may call it a reef, a barrier to travel, but people have been coming through here for a long time. Arches and Bryce perch by themselves in their spectacular locations off the beaten path. Here, native people use the permanent streams running through the fold as home and as trails for 12,000 years, leaving behind cultural traces and stories. Explorers looked out from Boulder Mountain, drawing their maps, like this gorgeous map from the Wheeler survey, and noticed that Wheeler ended up with nothing more to say about the water pocket fold than impracticable ridges, his caption over here on the edge of the map. So people were coming through, the explorers were coming through, drawing their maps, working their way through the fold and along the streams, as Jack Hillers did with some of the Powell expedition folks in 1872, down along Tantalus Creek and Pleasant Creek, or through the open draws of Cathedral Valley, journaling all the way. We go to these same pathways for our hikes. The only road across central Utah came through Capitol Reef too, right through Capitol Gorge for nearly a century. This was the main highway through south central Utah. And then the Fremont Canyon Highway replaced it in the 1960s with another through route. All of these routes brought travelers, and there often were writers in those vehicles. Both residents and visiting writers cherished the village of Fruta and its big personalities. And old-timers in Fruta self-published their nostalgic memories of both the pioneer Mormon settlers and the one-room schoolhouse. And I was able to use those reminiscences and memoirs as beautiful pieces of writing to bring alive these times of the little village, the time of historic people living in the middle of the park, along with the eccentric misfits who retired here in the 40s. And Fruta began to acquire a whole panoply of really interesting characters. The school ran from 1896 to 1941, and here you have some of those school children welcoming a governor of Utah in the 1920s. And I guess I have to admit, we still attract eccentric misfits to Wayne County and Garfield County. All of this makes for a lot of choices for the editor of a Capitol Reef anthology. Fruta still generates both fruit and fresh writing from younger writers like Jen Jackson Quintano, who writes of the 26 mason jars of sun-soaked Fruta apricots stored under her bed. She called these jeweled jars of memory. If some of you are as old as I am, you might recognize this spread from a book that was published in 1967. That calligraphed caption on the right, "Adventure is not in the guidebook and beauty is not on the map. Seek and ye shall find." I pretty much had memorized when I was in college. I pretty much had the whole book memorized. That was a spread from On the Loose by Terry and Rennie Russell. That was really a classic that introduced a lot of us to thinking about wilderness in terms of words and pictures. The Russell brothers created this book with their own photographs. They called them just cheap dime store prints, but they were incredibly thoughtful and incredibly passionate about the wilderness. And many years later, Rennie published another book called Rock Me on the Water, looking back at the experiences that led to On the Loose, which had sold more than 1 million copies over the years. And it turns out that they spent the summer of 1958 visiting their aunt and uncle in Fruta. And I never knew that until I read Rennie's book. And in his book, he talks about hanging out with Doc Inglesby, one of those eccentric characters who collected petrified wood and had a little funky motel in the orchards of Fruta, one of the favorite places to stay of Wallace Stegner when he came through. Rennie wrote about riding horses up and down the Fremont Canyon and watching the flash floods tumble over the cliffs, described those floodwaters filthy with desire and urgency. And I was really thrilled to sort of complete that circle from my early 20s, being passionate about On the Loose and finding out that there was this connection to Fruta. And it was great to include an excerpt from that more recent book. I scoured the bookshelves down at the Park Library and found an obscure 1986 Utah State University master's thesis in history, Capitol Reef, the Forgotten National Park. The author, Jonathan Thau, Thow, had done a superb job narrating the park's history, and I wanted to use a couple of excerpts from his work, but I needed his permission. It wasn't a name I knew. He hadn't stayed in academia. He wasn't easily visible on the web. And after much detective work, really over about 1.5 years, I finally found him. He's now a U.S. Navy judge advocate, an international law expert, and commanding officer of the Naval Justice School in Newport, Rhode Island. And so I called the Naval Justice School, and I got one of those phone directories, and the directory told me to punch in the first 3 letters of his name, and by God, I got his voicemail, and he called me back. And he was delighted to have this relic from his past, see print. There's controversy in the history of Capitol Reef, and I've not shied away from these stories. And the controversies all go back to the 1930s. This is a map I'm sure a lot of you know, the proposed Escalante National Monument that would have embraced all of Glen Canyon. It probably would have almost certainly prevented the building of Glen Canyon Dam, going all the way down to the Utah-Arizona border, and encompassing parts of Grand Staircase and Capitol Reef and Bears Ears and Canyonlands and the Labyrinth Canyon Wilderness along the Green River. Just an enormous preserve that would have been just magic if we had actually pulled it off. We didn't, of course. It kind of faded away. And when Bishop Pechtold and his brother-in-law, Joseph Hickman, pushed for a Wayne Wonderland National Park to boost the Wayne County economy as the Escalante National Monument disappeared, what they got in 1937 was a relatively small Capitol Reef National Monument that remained unfunded for decades, that was even opened to uranium mining in the 1950s. When Park Superintendent Bob Hyder drew boundaries to expand that small monument 6-fold in 1968, he asked his wife to secretly type up his proposal because his secretary at Capitol Reef, who should have been doing that, was Afton Taylor, wife of Wayne County rancher Don Taylor, who happened to be the president of the Wayne County Cattlemen's Association. And Hyder didn't want to blow his cover. President Lyndon Johnson made that map real when he signed an executive order while dressing for Richard Nixon's inauguration. Basically, LBJ signed that order while he was putting on his pants, getting ready for the inauguration. Here in southern Utah, not everyone was pleased. Boulder Town over the mountain briefly changed its name to Johnson's Folly in protest. Nonetheless, within 2 years, Congress made Capitol Reef a national park, and the Water Pocket Fold was protected for the first time all the way south to Halls Creek Narrows. And today, nearly 1.5 million visitors come to Capitol Reef in a single year. I mentioned controversy. Well, the Burr Trail is really the center of controversy for Capitol Reef. This is the only place you can really drive right up and over the water pocket fold on these switchbacks that were originally built by a sheepman and then made passable to vehicles during the uranium boom. And then the road goes on through the Circle Cliffs and over to the town of Boulder through Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. I took this aerial a while back when these roads were still dirt, and we have an excerpt in the anthology by Jared Farmer talking about the just relentless renegade paving by Garfield County and Wayne County, who were determined to pave the Burr Trail and take away the feeling of backcountry and remoteness and driving so close to the land, the feeling that you can only get on a dirt road. And they've pretty much won that fight over the years, but people keep pushing back. And the road within the park itself, down Nodum Road and up the switchbacks, remains dirt with these amazing views right along the very crest of the water pocket fold. But during that fight, in Jared Farmer's piece, he remembered as a young man seeing this little bit of graffiti on the bridge abutment over the gulch on the Burr Trail as it goes through the Circle Cliffs and heads toward the town of Boulder. And when I read his piece, I realized that I had taken a picture of that very same graffiti years ago. And I dug around in my files, and by God, I found it. And so we were able to use that as an illustration in the book. All this history is in the reader, and all this informs our lives still. I also found waiting for me on those shelves in the park library the oral histories collected by Brad Fry in the 1990s when he worked on an administrative history of the park. He had interviewed Billy Bullard and Lurt Nee, consecutive owners of the ranch on Pleasant Creek through most of the 20th century. I had interviewed both of these storytellers as well, so I was able to create standalone pieces combining stories and transcripts from both mine and Brad Fry's conversations. And I realized that I could build on these two pieces and tell the story of that ranch on Pleasant Creek all the way from F. Hanks, who came to the spot in 1881 and built his floral ranch there, where the Fremont had farmed as well, through Billy and Lurt, to Chip and Linda Ward, who ran Lurt's Sleeping Rainbow Guest Ranch in the 1970s. And when I gave a talk at Utah Valley University, I met Kiri Minukin, who ran writing workshops for the UVU field station, opened in 2008, that now stands on the spot of the guest ranch. And she enthusiastically shared work from 3 awestruck international students from Ukraine, Saudi Arabia, and Mali, who had been at the field station on one of her field trips, trying to make sense of Capitol Reef as wide-eyed first-timers and English language learners. This progression of pieces about the same spot in Pleasant Creek that spanned nearly 140 years is one of my favorites in the book. Wayne County nourishes its own community of resident creative folk, and they range from cowboy poets to newly resident writers. And I have to tell you, when I showed this picture, when I launched the book in Torrey at our little arts organization building, that one of the local ranchers, Dick Pace, came up to me after the talk and said, "Where'd you get that picture of me?" Well, this is a picture I took of a cattle drive in the park in 1975 without any idea that that rancher on that horse was Dick Pace, who still lives in Wayne County and had come to my talk just a couple of years ago. And Dick wanted to make sure that I knew the name of his horse. The name of the horse is Cheese, and it was a good horse. And so in the anthology, I definitely make a gesture toward these longtime legacy families, including a cowboy poem from our poet laureate, Ray Conrad, illustrated with this picture of another longtime rancher in Wayne County. I include a hiking narrative from Red Rock adventure guide Steve Howe and an essay by one of our resident writers, Chip Ward. And I decided to write a quick survey of artists in Capitol Reef as well, which gave me the chance to include a Guy Tull photograph, one of the photographers who now lives in Torrey, wonderful photographer, and a painting as well, this painting by Doug Snow. And I love the painting, which is entitled Capitol Reef. It's a big painting. It actually is about, maybe 30 feet high, huge painting that now adorns the wall behind the Supreme Court justices when they sit in the state courthouse in Salt Lake City. And when the painting was first hung there, the justices thought that it would be distracting to any of the lawyers who were presenting before them. And so for many years, it was covered up by drapes. And whenever there was an argument, it was only exposed when there was nothing going on in the courtroom. So few people ever saw them. More recently, the justices have decided that it's not really right to do that. Maybe the newer justices are more in tune with the painting itself, and it's now exposed all the time. My wife, who at one point in her career was an appellate lawyer and argued cases in that courtroom, has said vehemently that when you're arguing before the court, you are so focused on what you are doing that you would never even notice that there was a painting behind the justices. Doug Snow was someone who lived just outside the park at the base of the Coxcomb, a really serrated ridge of sandstone at the edge of Fish Creek Cove. And he painted it over and over and over again in all kinds of weather and in all kinds of ways. And I always think of him being sort of like Cézanne painting Mont Saint-Victoire over and over and over again. Some of the other photographers who've worked in the park were people who created lovely work, and I was able to include their work by including this little section of the book I called Capitol Reef Illustrated. Brice Barnbaum would come here running photo workshops for many years. John Fall made this picture that I just love called Moonrise over Pie Pan, where he put a pie pan in the foreground with the same size and reflectivity as the rising full moon over the water pocket fold. I had known the picture for years, but I'd never really thought about where it was taken. And during the pandemic, when I was living full-time in Torrey, I decided I'd try to figure out where he took the picture. And this is my recreation of John Fall's picture using our dog bowl rather than a pie pan. Not getting it exactly right, but almost exactly right. And some of the rocks have changed over the years, but it's still very much the same place. I was also able to make a gesture of respect toward the great Sierra Club photographers who were my mentors from a distance in my early days of photography. Philip Hyde, who photographed in the water pocket fold for the great Sierra Club book Slick Rock with text by Ed Abbey. Elliot Porter, who came through Capitol Reef to photograph for a book called American Places with text by Wallace Stegner. Elliot actually came through Capitol Reef when I was a ranger there and asked this young whippersnapper of a ranger for ideas about where to take pictures. And I sent him to Fountain Tanks in the South District of the park. And when the book came out, it included this photograph, which I always thought had been taken on that very day when I sent Elliot Porter out into the backcountry, and of course was thrilled with that. But when we got permission to reproduce the picture in our book, it was dated 1963, many years before my summer as a ranger. So maybe that's true, but I think it's a mistake. I think this is the picture Elliot took when I sent him to Fountain Tanks. I also discovered James Swenson's work on the history of photography in Utah National Parks. I first heard James when he gave a talk at the Entrada Institute in Torrey, our little arts center, several years ago. And when I asked him if he had anything to contribute to the anthology, he turned his talk into an original piece for the reader about the Minor White picture that he calls Capitol Reef's most famous photograph. This is it, and you may recognize it. It's in almost every survey of 20th century American arts, especially 20th century American photography. And Minor White came to the park several summers and found this probably only 3 or 4 feet expanse of Moen Kopi sandstone. It made this extraordinary abstract. I've been keeping an eye out for that particular piece of rock. I have yet to find it, but I have great hopes that someday I'll stumble upon it. I've realized that the first question I get about the reader is, how did I find all this cool material, work from nearly 50 writers? My bedrock for building the reader is the stuff I read when I first arrived here. Wallace Stegner, Clarence Dutton, Ed Abbey, Ann Zwinger. My other starting point, the bookshelf of works published by the Capitol Reef Natural History Association over the years. I asked fellow writers, scholars, and regional experts for advice. Did they have anything to suggest? What would they include? I'm a natural history writer, and so I could look through the work of my friends and colleagues to find great writing about Capitol Reef. Amazon.com turns out to be a great research tool as well. The company may be taking over the world, but they are thorough. Maybe that's why they are taking over the world. I searched for books on the Amazon website using every keyword I could think of. Capitol Reef, Water Pocket Fold, Fruta, Wayne County, Boulder Mountain, Aquarius Plateau, Fremont River. You get the idea. In my searching, I found my way to a book I didn't know, Gary Ferguson's book, Shouting at the Sky, based on time he spent around Capitol Reef with kids enrolled in the Aspen Institute's Wilderness Therapy Program. Gary described his fieldwork for that book as the most significant personal experience I've ever had. His description of a night in the Red Desert, just east of the park, is one of my favorite passages in the Reader. The full moon spilling down the shoulders of Caneville Reef, across the long, flat sweeps of sage and rabbit brush and greasewood, through a thin braid of dry, nameless washes, onto the faces of 7 teenage girls scattered across the ground at the edge of a box canyon, hoping for sleep. To illustrate Gary's piece, I went out to photograph that full moon spilling across the Red Desert late one summer night. It was absolutely exhilarating to be out there alone in the middle of nowhere, the desert bright by moonlight under a canopy of stars. And I encourage you all to find your own place in the middle of nowhere to have a similar experience. I was determined to include Ellen Malloy, Utah's best writer, who died much too soon in 2004. When Ellen walked along the Navajo sandstone spine of Combe Ridge outside her home in Bluff and wrote about the slick rhotica of Indian paintbrush and cliff rose in spring, she could just as easily have been writing about the Navajo sandstone spine of the Water Pocket Fold. So I was able to use her smart, funny, and gorgeous writing. I skimmed each new book to find passages to excerpt, scanned those pages, and plopped the new piece on my pile. I shuffled these into themes. I had to eliminate some, go back to searching for others to fill gaps. Short and many, nearly every author proved generous and cooperative. The highest reprint fees came from the publishers and agents managing the legacies of deceased authors, where I had no chance to plead nonprofit publisher poverty with the writer herself. At the same time, the book pushed me into organizing my thousands of photos from the park, taken over these past decades. Once I had all those slides pulled together, all those digital images in their place on my hard drives, I began editing, choosing not just my favorites, but images that I knew would best illustrate my excerpts. I searched the files at the park, at the Utah Historical Society, and at Marriott Library at the University of Utah for maps and historic images like this picture of Dewey Gifford pulling a hapless tourist out of the mud after flash floods in the Fremont Canyon at Fruta. I created a portfolio section that I could feature a few photos that you all might even call art, details and landscapes that are more pure graphic and light than illustration. And I began with the castle. And whenever I use this picture, whenever I begin a slideshow with this picture, I always pair it with this quote from Willa Cather about the bright edge of the world that I think really captures what it feels like to be out there in Slick Rock country. A picture that we actually used on the cover of my very first book with a spine, published by the Museum of Northern Arizona in 1979, a book called The Bright Edge. As with any book, once I had a draft, let me go back a minute. I want to tell you a little bit more about these pictures in the portfolio. So these were pictures of mine that really didn't match as illustration to any of the excerpts, but pictures that are among my favorites. Pictures that are reflections, or just playing with the landscape, running along the spine of the Manka Shale, composing graphically with a juniper snag or a leaf blown into mud curls. I had great fun doing that. As with any book, once I had a draft, I gave the manuscript to friends and colleagues for review. The park superintendent, local historians, smart friends, the general editor of the series, all gave me invaluable advice. I used my prerogative as editor to close the reader with my own words. I chose an excerpt from the last chapter in my book, Bargaining for Eden, where I do my best to figure out Wayne County, this classic small town, long winter, droughty summer Western challenge. And I end both the reader and Bargaining for Eden with a credo. I wrote this piece 15 years ago when I tried to boil down into a bulleted list what I believed about land, community, and honor after 50 odd years of living in the imperial West and learning from the past, from my mentors, from the stories of impassioned advocates on all sides, from the canyons, from the mountains, from the mesa, a statement too of my dreams for the future. You'll have to judge if I've done so fairly when you get around to taking a look at the book. And so I hope the Capitol Reef Reader serves as a primer to this place so many of us love, an introduction to an incredibly rich literature created over many decades, a celebration of our home. Thank you. And so I will bring you back.
Wow, thank you very much, Steve. That was fantastic. And I want to invite everybody to submit any questions you might have to Steve in our chat box, or you can just raise your hand on the bottom of the screen, or speak up, unmute yourself and speak to yourself. I will mention that I have my copy of the Capitol Reef Reader right here at home, and the only thing it's missing, Steve, is your autograph inside of it. But I spent 2 summers in Capitol Reef working for the Student Conservation Association in the 1980s and absolutely fell in love with the landscape. And so your words tonight really rang true for me, and I'm sure they did for people who have been to Capitol Reef and recognize it as probably the best national park in Utah. So Beth Cook has written in the chat, fascinating. I am ordering the book. Thank you very much, Beth. I appreciate that.
So do I.
Yes. And from Davy Crockett, he says, thank you, exclamation point. I've run hundreds of miles alone in most sections of the park, exploring the slot canyons, under the towers of Cathedral Valley, up to switchbacks of the Bird Trail, and on top of the Water Pocket Fold. So Davy knows the park in a way that many of us don't by running on those backcountry trails. I wonder, Davy, if you have run through the Muley Twist, which is one of the more hidden places already. Karen Grieg writes, I already have a copy, but not autographed. Great presentation. And Susan Golightly, Wayne, speak geologically on Water Pocket Fold and Capitol Reef. Well, I don't want to steal Stephen's thunder, but I think you know, Susan, from taking classes, that that's a gigantic monocline, almost 100 miles long, across that portion of the Colorado Plateau. And fortunately, that fold in the Earth's crust exposes the Glen Canyon group, Wingate Sandstone, Kayenta Formation, and Navajo Sandstone, from which the park takes its name. The rounded domes in the Navajo Sandstone reminded people of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And Davy did reply. He said, yes, I've run through Muley Twist a half a dozen times. That was my first exposure to the park. I did have a question for you, Steve, and I just wonder, I know that you are an advocate for the protection of southwestern parks and landscapes in general. And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to any outstanding threats that might be imminent for the Capitol Reef region. I know that there may be some coal beds that are east of the park, and certainly there's off-road trails around Factory Butte, but can you just speak to that a little bit about any of the threats that might be looming for Capitol Reef?
Sure. And before I answer your question, Wayne, let me respond to what some of the things you just said. Many people have said to me, "Oh, you must know Capitol Reef better than anyone." And my answer is always no, I don't. And it's clear that people like Davey know it better than I do. People that have really made a point of trying to get up and down every canyon and along every ridge. My I love Capitol Reef. I've been to many obscure places, but I'm not a rock climber. I'm not a canyoneer, and so there are many places that I have not been, and I have a lot of respect and some envy for people that have been to even more places than I have. Also, you did a great job on the geology, Wayne, of course, and you sounded just like a park ranger. And I look forward to signing people's books when I have the chance. So the threats to Capitol Reef right now are really threats from too many people. The visitor center was built back in the days of the Park Service's Mission 66, when the Park Service prepared in the 1950s for what they expected to happen in 1966. And the visitor center looks a lot like it did when I was a ranger there. They've only recently updated the exhibits, but it's no bigger. And there's just one little bathroom. And if you've been to Capitol Reef, you know that Highway 24, the state highway, bisects bisects the park at its waist and leaves all the country to the north and south empty. And there are some dirt roads that take you into Cathedral Gorge, and there are dirt roads that take you south into the park. And then there's the scenic drive right along the western face of the Water Pocket Fold. And everyone is concentrated on those places. And so the park is actually, for the first time, beginning to expand parking areas, widening the scenic drive this summer. The scenic drive will be closed this summer, which is going to be a big deal for visitation. But when the Utah Travel Council, the Department of Tourism, started promoting the Mighty Five National Parks of Utah, the parks really became overwhelmed with people. People who were just coming to tick off those 5 parks very quickly. Zion sees the most visitation, Canyonlands the least, and Capitol Reef the second least. But we're still seeing millions and millions of people. And so you don't really necessarily think of visitation as a threat, but I think that it is. Other kinds of threats are certainly potential mining. There's only one grazing permit left in the park, and I imagine that will probably be retired in the next generation. These days, the big issue in southern Utah is really off-road vehicles. And you may be aware that the country over along the green between Labyrinth Canyon and Moab, right around Labyrinth Canyon, there's a new travel plan that tries to limit the routes that off-road vehicles can take. And that's super controversial. The state is fighting it. And the BLM is trying to take these steps to be a little bit more conservation minded. Same thing happening at Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, where I've been on the board of Grand Staircase Escalante Partners for the past 6 years. We restored the boundaries of Bears Ears and Grand Staircase after Trump eviscerated the 2 monuments. But we now need to create a forward-looking, conservation-based, science-based master plan, resource management plan for both of those monuments. And the recommended resource management plan for Grand Staircase, which comes right up to Capitol Reef, right at the top of the Burr Trail, is pretty good. And the BLM, again, is trying to take that step to be more conservation-minded. But the local elected politicians are fighting it every step of the way. A Garfield County commissioner recently called members of regional conservation organizations terrorists. So it's always a struggle.
I'm wondering, Steve, if you could mention to people who might want to visit Capitol Reef some of the places to stay in Torrey. There are some really excellent accommodations there for a very small village in southern Utah. And also the campground at Capitol Reef is often oversubscribed many months in advance just because of how beautiful that is in the big trees. But can you speak a little bit about some of the modern amenities available to visitors in Torrey?
Sure. Yeah, you're right. The campground's gorgeous. It's in the orchards. You can practically pick apricots off the trees from your tent. And you're right, it's full every night all the way through the summer. There's only that one major campground in the park. There are two tiny remote campgrounds with just an outhouse, one in the south and one in the north. So people are often overflowing onto BLM land on either side of the park. In places, it's onto national forest land as well. And there are plans to build much more substantial campgrounds right on the edge of the park on those other public lands to accommodate all that overflow camping, the boondockers, as I've learned to call them. And like everywhere else in the West, we have access to this incredible public land where we can camp kind of anywhere we want as long as we're not driving off road. My family mantra for that is the best campsite can be found on a dirt road, off a dirt road, off a dirt road. And there are places like that around Capitol Reef. You're right, Torrey just keeps growing. We have not yet turned into Springdale or Moab or Tusayan, and I think we never will, probably because there's not enough water, and probably not, and there's not enough private land as well. But there are several new motels, one of which features the dark night skies. We are a dark night sky community. Capitol Reef is a dark night sky park. And there are a bunch of Airbnbs, a bunch of places with small little cabins with, small kitchens. I don't really need to give you the names, but if you go online, you'll be surprised at all the places that you can stay at Torrey. And even our food is getting better. We've always said that Boulder is the place for great food because of Hell's Backbone Grill and several other places over in Boulder. But we now have better food, and we have Etta Place Cidery, named after Etta Place, which the Sundance Kid's girlfriend, played by Catherine Ross in the movie, making hard cider. They just got their bar license. We now have a bar in Torrey. And we're building something called the Torrey Mercantile, which will be kind of a center for tourists to come to eat in a food court. There'll be a sports bar and a FedEx drop-off and a liquor store, and it kind of brings Torrey into the 21st century. It's a little bit like the line I heard from someone I interviewed in Escalante years ago, who said, yeah, we just skipped the 20th century in Escalante. We went right from the 19th to the 21st. And we're kind of doing that.
Oh, that's great. Well, we did fix the link to order the book. There was a problem with it a little bit, but we've got the live link up there. And I guess we don't have any more questions. Any final words to our audience tonight? We had 29 participants, including yourself, Steve. So pretty good turnout on a cold Tuesday night. And I think I will just say in closing, before Steve gives his final remarks, if you do go to Capitol Reef, you can just bypass Zion and Arches when you go to Utah because they're way too overcrowded. And if you have a four-wheel drive vehicle and you want to get into some really wild Colorado Plateau scenery, that for much of it is just like it was when all of us were first introduced to this landscape in the 1970s, you can find it in both the North and South districts of Capitol Reef National Park. Steve, any final words?
Well, I will reinforce what you said. I will point out you don't need a rugged four-wheel drive vehicle. We have had a Subaru Outback for years, and we've taken it everywhere that you can drive in the park, and many places in Grand Staircase. When I was a ranger in Capitol Reef, I had a 1962 Dodge Dart, and I took that to almost all of the same places. And I actually reveled in running a backcountry tour for people who were visiting the park. And I would use a park sedan, and we would drive down the dirt Nodum Road and up the Burr Trail, and I would turn them loose at the top of the switchbacks after lunch and let them find their way back to the campground, either by coming the way we had come or driving the Burr Trail and over Boulder Mountain, all on dirt roads. And I never saw so many wide-eyed people. Capitol Reef is a remarkable place.
Yes.
And, it's very easy to find the solitude and the quiet there that I think so many of us need and enjoy and grow from. Even when the Hickman Bridge Trail parking lot is overflowing, people are parking up and down the highway. if you just go across the highway and walk up the trail the other direction, you will be by yourself. And we all know that's true in almost any national park. Even at
Yeah.
the Grand Canyon, we know that's true. You just walk along the rim away from those viewpoints, and you have these landscapes to yourself. So I encourage you to read all that wonderful writing about the park, which will inspire you to come. And once you know the place, you will spend the rest of your life fighting to preserve the place. That's the way it works, right? So thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Steve. And I do want to mention again, if you want to see more about Steve's 25 award-winning books, you can just go to stephentrimble.net and you can learn about his fascinating life, a life in the American West and mostly on the Colorado Plateau. And I do want to remind you all that next month on January 9th at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, we'll have Alan Peterson of the Museum of Northern Arizona talking about Gunnar Wheatfurs. And for all of our members that joined us tonight, thank you so much for being members of the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And if you have enjoyed this tonight, we invite you to join us at grandcanyonhistory.org. Good night, everybody, and thank you for joining us.